Hi, my name is Lizzie Chan, and I'm a member of the CPR Institute's Young Leaders in Alternative Dispute Resolution. And I am delighted to host today's episode of the Y-ADR Corporate Counsel interview series. The Y-ADR seeks to educate the next generation of leaders in the ADR field about the full spectrum of dispute prevention and resolution mechanisms, and to provide an insider's view into CPR's community of in-house counsel, external counsel, and other experts in the ADR field about how they're using these mechanisms to manage conflict to enable purpose. And as part of this goal, I'm speaking to corporate counsel and companies all around the world to ask them about their experiences with ADR and to invite them to share their career advice for young practitioners in the ADR field. Today, I am delighted to welcome Fritha Wheeler-Ozanne, who is Senior Counsel at Fluor Corporation in Texas. Hi, Fritha. We're delighted to have you with us today.
Hi, Lizzie. Great to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
It is our pleasure. And my first question for you is, can you tell us a little bit about your career experience, your role, your current role, and the types of disputes that you're involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. So a bit of a winding path to where I am now. So I went to uni and qualified in Scotland. And then I moved to London for a few years doing more international sorts of disputes. Then I was in Sydney, Australia for I think almost 4 years, working with Jones Day, and also Fluor was a client there. So I was working on a big dispute and got to know the folk at Fluor, and then moved to Dallas, Texas with Jones Day, but only briefly because then a role came up at Fluor. So I sort of jumped ship about 4 months into moving here and joined the dispute team at Fluor's headquarters here in Dallas. So now I do entirely dispute resolution work, generally international sorts of disputes, and very much largely arbitration, some litigation in some spots in the world, and a fair amount of mediation, but I would say principally it's international arbitration work with the team here.
You have such a rich and global career experience. One of the things that's really important to CPR is focusing on avoiding conflict and managing risks to avoid a fully fledged dispute. And one of that focus for CPR is because we want businesses to get on with doing what they do best, and so avoiding disputes is an important part of that. So I was wondering if you could tell us what your company does to try to avoid conflicts or disputes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from being in private practice, that was definitely a focus, but it is definitely front and center when you're in-house because nobody wants to spend money on what I do, which is fine. So we work quite hard and closely with the business to try and help them when issues arise on live ongoing projects rather than wait to the end. Obviously, that still happens too and accounts for, the formal dispute resolution I do. But we have a corporate claims management group who are a team of really great individuals who are, have great project experience as well as claim experience. And so I think that's a real key part. That team is a real key part in us being able to work with projects and business lines to sort of help them resolve disputes before they become disputes. And if we do that work right, hopefully the dispute doesn't materialize. But if it does, I think that our internal clients are in a better position because they've done some of the homework and the negotiation, and they've tested out some of the issues at an earlier stage and are in a better position in the event that it does go to arbitration or some other mechanism.
We talked about previously about your work in ADR across your career, and both at Fluor now, and you've done so many different types of ADR. I think you mentioned adjudication, mediation, and arbitration. Do you think that ADR is suitable for all commercial claims?
I would say yes, because it's sort of exclusively what I do. I'm sure there are lots of areas where it's not as common or as suitable, but for the work I do, Absolutely. It's been the majority. So you're absolutely right. The adjudication experience from being in London and Australia was really key. And I think that is a great tool for resolving disputes, particularly when you've got an ongoing project. And obviously the emphasis is cash flow. Since being in the States, they've not had nearly as much experience in doing adjudication, whereas previously that was definitely a big portion of my work. And so now I would say it's sort of almost, the vast majority is arbitration, and that's a dispute resolution mechanism in our contracts. Obviously we look for off-ramps, and so a lot of those will have a mediation at some point during them, whether it's sort of formally scheduled or just sort of naturally arises at an appropriate time. We do sort of both. And then there's still some, big scale litigation in some spots in the world. But I would say, ADR for all of the disputes I'm involved has definitely been considered, if not required.
I think a good practice is, at the beginning of a commercial relationship, when we're negotiating the contract, we think about the types of disputes that might eventuate, and then think about dispute resolution processes that might be most suitable for resolving disputes that might come up in the context of that relationship. I was wondering, are you involved in that contract negotiation stage? And what are some things you think about when determining on a process?
Yeah, so unfortunately not. I've never done any transactional experience. It's always been on sort of the back end side of disputes. But obviously, the first thing I do when I look at a contract is see what the dispute resolution clause says. And I think you're right. I think it would be, I think sometimes it's not at the forefront of people's mind because the relationship's off to a budding start. No one wants to think about it. But in those clauses where, it is really well thought of and they have a good structured process and they've got an appropriate law and forum, it makes a big difference when it winds up sort of in my lap. So good to think about it.
So in principle, what do you think about multi-tier dispute resolution clauses where you have, quite clear stages for, say, like, pre-arbitration negotiation, then mediation, then arbitration? Or do you think it's better to keep it simple and pick one forum?
Yeah, great question. And I think probably not a one size fits all question, because I think it depends so much on the client and the relationship. And that might be different at the start compared to the end. I've seen where those sort of multi-tiered steps work really well. And it's, people on both sides have taken them seriously and they've gone, it's not just a case of going through the motions. I've seen other times when it's a box ticking exercise and people just know this is going into a full blown dispute. And so it's just things have soured too much for those to really be effective. But I do think, when you've got sort of sophisticated people on both sides, that it can be really helpful tool to sort of give some structure to that, rather than someone rushing off to arbitration and then sort of backwards thinking, okay, well, now we'll have a discussion, when you've already sort of spent a lot of time and money getting to where you are. So
yeah, speaking of contracts, one thing I wanted to mention is the CPR has a pledge for dispute prevention where companies agree to commit to thinking about dispute prevention processes. And one of the resources that the CPR has produced are model clauses for dispute prevention. So they do things that, you include a clause in the contract that says that the parties are going to be intentional about trying to avoid disputes. And they're going to, in advance identify people who might be involved in, pre-dispute negotiation or settlement talks. So that's
I think that's, and I think that's really positive. And I think just, if people are thinking about that, then they're, they have the right things in mind. So I think that's great.
Assuming we do go into a fully fledged dispute in a litigation or arbitration, what are you looking for when you're selecting external counsel?
Good question. So we have a lot of sort of long-term, relationships with firms that I joined Fluor in 2018. So there's been some of those disputes have just been inherited because they're long running. And that's got its own advantages because obviously those firms know Fluor, they know who's who, how we work, what our systems are, all the sort of quirks that I'm sure we have. And then there have been other firms that we've sort of engaged with more recently, and those relationships have been good and sort of flourished, and we've given more work their way. So I would say, experience in dispute resolution, obviously, but also particularly construction and engineering disputes. I think those are sort of niche disputes, and you want someone that, yes, is great at international arbitration if that's what you're looking at, but someone who's also going to be able to get into sort of the weeds on the technical issues and have good relationships with potential experts. Delay in quantum always comes up, but also the technical issues, and also be able to speak to the witnesses who are, project controls and engineering and very sort of technical specific skill sets. And then also, I think just, someone that gets our culture and, on a personal level, you're able to have like a good rapport with and get on with, because I find that, when I was in private practice, I sort of thought in-house was this dreamy utopia and it was going to be a perfect work-life balance. I would say it's great, but it's not perfect. And so someone that, understands the demands on an in-house counsel's time, which is, feels quite frantic from day to day. So having someone that's, going to take that stress away rather than add to it is always appreciated.
There's a question that, external counsel often ask about like the value of networking. In your experience, have you hired external counsel after getting to know them through, say, like a BD event or a conference? Like, are they really helpful for winning a new client?
Yeah, I would say definitely. Like, it's so much about relationships, and like I was saying, you sort of expect like the people that we are looking at, the firms that are looking at, the individuals, they've all got great experience. So what sets someone's apart is their ability to look at business needs and in-house counsel needs and the demands that go beyond just the technical sort of running of a dispute and great international arbitration experience or whatever. It's very much relationships. Are you a good fit with me, my team, the witnesses you're going to speak to, others in the law department? So how does that all fit in? And I think business development or networking is the only time that you can really do that in a setting that's not as formal as when you're actually giving advice on something. And I would also say not just at the outset of a relationship. Like, I find it helpful during the course of a dispute to meet with someone, not for the purpose of like a witness statement or something, but just go for coffee or dinner or whatever it is, or virtual, but just some sort of it's networking, but it's more just sort of relationship building, or once you've got something ongoing, also like extending that networking to team members so that you're not just interfacing with the partner, the senior associate, but you're knowing more of the team and what they're doing and who they are. I think that's really helpful too. So I would say more of it, more coffee.
That's wonderful. And I'm so glad you mentioned, the whole team effort as well.
Yeah, very much so.
I was wondering if you have any diversity expectations when you're hiring external counsel.
Yeah, I do, as a woman in sort of a male-dominated industry, twofold, like law and construction. It's mainly not women that I speak with. And so it strikes me as odd when you have a team that is, you're looking at some teams on masters where it's sort of entirely male legal teams, experts, panels, but the in-house counsel, myself and others are female. So it definitely is noticeable to me. I think as an organization, we're getting better about being more vocal, about sort of what expectations are. And there's a spectrum with firms. There's, some firms, need to have questions asked with. Other firms are great and they will naturally put, female candidates for arbitrations or for mediations. And I think that's great because obviously I work with a lot of females, in law firms and associates. But the panels that we've got ongoing at the moment, there's not adequate representation of, females or people from other, diverse backgrounds. So definitely more to be done. But I think the conversation is happening. And I think that, as an in-house person, that being a client, that you could be a little bit demanding and hopefully make a difference.
I'm really heartened to hear that you take a real leadership role in advancing diversity. And I agree with you, diversity is much more at the forefront of the minds of those in the ADR field. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about some specific topics in disputes. And my first one is about the environment and ADR. Is there more we can do here?
Yeah, I think the pandemic, I think, has had a sort of an impact on that, because I have, been to, I think, one in-person meeting where I've had to travel to since February 2020, I guess. And so I think, I do think there are times when you need to be in person if you're doing prep with a witness. It's hard to do that entirely virtual. We're getting better at it with breaks and understanding people are human. They can't just sit in front of a screen for 4 hours without breaks. But I think, that shift to, do we really need to travel for this, I think is making a difference, or it's speeding up the direction that we were going to. I think there are a lot of people that just didn't want to do that because it's not the way they've done it in the past. Well, now we have to, and we're getting better at it. And I hope that, yes, there will be times, I hope, where we can travel and meet in person and for hearings and, key prep. That's great when it's all day meetings, but I'm hopeful that we don't travel, for a 2-hour meeting. Is that necessary? Is that sensible to have all of that, carbon? Probably not. I think also, the tools around documents, I see a lot less bundles, like over the last year and a half, all my bundles are out of date and now everything's electronic. And I think that's a shift too, when you realize, hopefully everyone in sort of ADR is getting better at that. So I think there's more to be done, but I'm maybe one positive about the last year and a half is that some of it's been sort of sped up because of what we can't do at the moment.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I mean, I don't think this video interview series would have been so easy before the pandemic, because now
Right.
Everybody's familiar with using Zoom. I don't
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. And it's, we're on video all the time. So it's just a bit more, it's a bit more normal and you get better at it. I'm better at it now than I was before. I hated to have my video on previously. And now I'm like, I put it on, people can see me and I'm more engaged in the conversation. I think everyone's getting better at it. So yeah.
Exactly. And everybody, many people are now set up with the equipment to do it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like having a webcam and audio. So that's made
it,
yeah. And I think I've actually found it really beneficial for meetings, particularly in groups, because, sometimes I don't remember people's names. But now I can say, and then also I know who's talking as well, which makes it
exactly. And yes, we are all separated, but we're also, I feel like, talking more. And you're seeing, usually it's my, my home behind me. So there is a sort of, we're further away, but it's more intimate in some ways because like, well, I've seen your house for the last year every other day. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's great that it has this benefit for the environment.
Yes.
But related to the issue of reducing costs, what are some ideas you have about how to manage costs and budgeting in ADR disputes?
Yeah, budgeting is so important. From the switch to the in-house role, I spend so much of my time budgeting because there are so many like internal client demands. So within the law department, we really try and do our best to forecast and then track spend across a matter. And obviously there is no crystal ball, things happen and that we can't foresee it, but we really try to work hard with firms. And we have a great resource and someone who is sort of ex-project controls who is helping, it's now in corporate claims management team, who is now helping to get our budgets into like a really great format that I think forces firms to think about, well, how much are we spending? How, who's doing that job and how much time are they going to spend on it? And try and track that through so that at the end of a lot of work in the background, we can go to the business and say, this is our anticipated spend on a quarter by quarter basis until the hearing. And so that's really helpful at the outset. And I think it's also making sure that it's holistic, like it doesn't include just law firms, but that the law firm is testing budgets with experts or potential experts and other big outlays, like, if it's an arbitration for a month-long hearing, like what's the venue cost, what are the travel costs? They're going to be significant, particularly when you've got people from all over the world that need to attend as, witnesses or whatever. So I think having that sort of stress test dialogue at the start is very helpful, not right at the start, but at the appropriate time when we know enough about a dispute. But then also we track it internally, we track costs, and then we re-engage with firms at the appropriate time. So if there's a big milestone in a case, like we get a defense in or we file something, that's usually a good point to say, okay, well, we now know how many witnesses there are, how many experts, are there other issues we now have to think about? Are there going to be sort of pre-hearing motions, and trying to adjust the numbers. And then that dialogue is really helpful for me when I have to go and have difficult conversations with the business and say, this is how much it costs, or this is how much extra it costs, but these are the reasons, and these are, the specific amounts of money that we're attributing to each of those reasons. So the more information we have, and that as open and transparent as that dialogue is, I think it makes my job a lot easier. And I know that budgets are, the non-chargeable work that gets left to the bottom, but being in-house, they're very much at the top of people's lists of worries.
I think you make a really good point about costs and budgeting, and there's like in international arbitration, we're doing a lot more now to track like the costs that can, like the legal costs and expert costs, etc., that can be recovered at the end of an arbitration. So for example, there's like a recent Allen Overy and Bickel survey on average costs in international investment treaty arbitration. And I'm really interested in this issue of cost because I'm co-authoring a chapter in a book about the recovery of in-house costs specifically. And I'm not sure if you've done arbitration before, but actually recording time or some way of what in-house counsel are doing, and then actually including that in your request for cost recovery at the end of the arbitration. And this recognizes the modern role, the evolving role of in-house counsel, which tends to be much more involved in the arbitration process, like participating in a procedural conference or organizing a mock arbitration.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point, which is the internal cost as well. So thanks for mentioning I should have, because that is obviously when I speak to the business, these are the external costs, but this is the internal costs, which they're, monitoring and recording, and, how can we put ourselves in the best spot to recover that, hopefully. Because no one wants to spend time or money on these things, which is fine, but we need to track things really carefully rather than getting to the end and trying to do it, backwards.
I want to ask another question that I think young practitioners will be especially interested in, which is what they can do to work more effectively with in-house counsel. I mean, I think you'll probably have general advice for external counsel across the board, but I wonder if you have any advice as well for young practitioners who may not have a lot of visibility with the client, and who may be quite, in the early stages of your career. It's hard to learn how to think commercially, how to think from the client's perspective. So do you have any advice in that regard for our viewers?
Yeah, I guess two things come to mind. One, speak up, and two, don't show you're working. So I guess what I mean by that is the don't show you're working was one of the best lessons I had when I was a trainee in Glasgow. Was I'd been asked this question, and I'd gone off and I'd done what I thought was really great research, and I'd written it all out in this sort of really long email that nobody cared about. It was the advice I got from the partner I worked with was, you don't need to show you're working. Like the last paragraph is enough. If you need to do the work, like that's helpful. And if it helps you to write it out, that's fine. But what do you actually need to communicate? And sometimes you do need to communicate a lengthy amount of information, but either do a summary or set up a call to talk through it, because, my heart sinks when I open an email and it's sort of 12 paragraphs long. If it's sort of more than 3 paragraphs, I think it probably is worthy of a conversation as to what am I specifically looking at? What do I need to be concerned about? Because I have more matters than I did when I was in private practice. And so I'm trying to sort of, stay on top of all of them. And so that's a really helpful tool, is to be able to communicate effectively and what sort of need to know, and what's, for background, we thought about this, and this, but this is where we landed. That's helpful. That can be done over the phone rather than a beautiful piece of research. So that's one thing. And then, just the speaking up. I think one thing I wish I'd done better when I was more junior would be just to speak up in meetings with in-house counsel or clients or whoever it is. I think I always assumed that if something wasn't being said, everyone in the room was smarter than I was, and so it wasn't a good thing to say. And I just think it's now I really try to encourage more junior associates to speak up. And I know from the bills I review that they're spending a lot of time on the detail. And so they know a lot of the work and they've done all the legwork on it. So I really try and encourage that now, but I wish I'd done more of it myself when I was younger. And I think going in-house has forced me to sort of, do more because people are looking to me for instructions. And so I think that's a good thing. I think it just takes a bit of encouragement. And if you're with anyone else and you can help them to give them a specific speaking role during a meeting and say, okay, I'm going to want you to talk about this, that's helpful. And, there's no stupid questions. So yeah, those two things come to mind.
Thank you for inviting, young practitioners to speak up. I think it means a lot to them to hear from the client perspective. I wanted to respond to your first point about being concise. What do you do with an email from external counsel or a member from external counsel? Like, do you have to translate it for your business counterparts? Or is the best email the one where you can just forward to your business colleagues and say, like, see below? Yeah,
good question. I would say there's sort of a threshold question of like, how material is this? Does it change something? Are we talking about prospects and risk? Or is it something that's going to inform like what path we take or what we do with a particular witness, but may not be as important to the business at this stage, obviously important to the dispute in long term. So I think it sort of depends on what the subject is, but I think there are some times when I've said, okay, had a conversation, said, can you put this in an email so that I can forward it on? But I would generally not forward on emails unless it's a particular issue that we've been discussing. I generally would wait, and then I will do updates at key times. So if we've got a big filing deadline, I will work with the business before we file to say what we're doing, and then I will speak with them afterwards to say, this is what we did, this is what the other side did, this is what we're looking at over the next few months. And so at that point, I will probably engage with the firms to do sort of my homework with them and understand, like, what do you think about this development? What do you think that means? So that I can then communicate that internally around other things as well, like, witness availability, how much time that means, what resources we need, budget impact, all of those things that, that's probably more my bag than an external firm's.
This is a really interesting window into the work that you do. My next question is, if there was one thing you could change about commercial arbitration, what would it be?
Yeah, I think diversity. I think this is like such an area that's just ripe for doing more. I think there's more, there are more conversations happening about it. And I think that's great. I think there have been conversations about diversity since I started practicing, like 2000, too long ago. But I think it's, it's sometimes it's difficult to not, just to get a bit impatient and just say, well, we've been talking about this. I've been talking about this for a decade. Can we just see some results now? Can we see more females on panels and people from other diverse backgrounds on panels without it being mentioned? But, the conversation needs to keep happening for that to materialize, I guess. But yeah, I think more now would be good.
I think the great thing is we're seeing that conversation happening in lots of different places. At least for my part, I sit as a board member of Arbitral Women, which is an organization that seeks to promote the work that our members are doing. I'm also part of the Equal Representation in Arbitration Pledge Young Practitioners Subcommittee, which has the specific goal of getting more women appointed as arbitrators.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's definitely something that requires ongoing, specific and concrete action and just keeping it at the forefront of everyone's minds.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly it. Keeping it at the forefront, being a bit demanding about it, and then hopefully it becomes normal at some point.
So a big question and a personal reflection, which is, if you could do it all again, what would you tell your younger self?
I would say to myself, speak up and be more concise. But I would also, I think I always knew that I wanted to travel and, have more of an international career. And I think law can sometimes be seen as, limiting in that respect. And so I I think, it's taken a while for me to, realize that no, actually you have to sort of requalify, and that's painful, but worth it to sort of, do the extra work and be able to move around. So I would say be confident in that. But I think also just sort of look around you, and there's so many people to learn from, and you can take great skills from other people you're with, but also just to figure out what your own style is, not to sort of necessarily emulate someone who, okay, it works for them to stay up until 4 a.m. every night doing work. That doesn't work for me. I'm a morning person. I have to do it the other way around, and I collapse by about 9 or 10. So, it's figuring out, what works for you and what kind of style do you want to have. And, some people are very formal in their communications. I'm probably more informal and like to have a better rapport with people I'm speaking with. And I think that hopefully, materializes in sort of trust and, productive relationships. But I think it's just taking a bit of confidence early on to say, this is how I want to work, and this is what I want to do. And, this is how I'm going to do it. And there's no right or wrong. There's a spectrum, and figure out what works best for you, and what kind of how that fits in with your life as well, with your career. If it's, what other interests do you have? Is it family? Is it exercise? Is it some other interesting hobby that I just don't have the talent to be able to do? But whatever it is, just make time for it so that you can have a long lasting career, rather than, focusing so much on it at the expense of everything else.
Absolutely. I've been told that, our careers are a marathon, not a sprint. And your advice to bring your authentic self to work is really important, even though it's really often very difficult to do.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's a much better way of saying it, bringing your authentic self to work. That's a great way to say it. I will use that.
And learning to draw boundaries. I think that's really difficult as well.
It's so difficult. And I think that's a transition at the start. There are no boundaries. You're 100%. This is, my 100% focus. And then as you go through life, other things crop up, and you have to sort of make it all work to try and do more. So
my final question for you is, what is your advice for those looking to go in-house?
Good question. I would say that every in-house role is so different. I feel like in law firms, in my experience of being in private practice, it's a pretty linear career progression. Where you should be in 3 years, 6 years, 10 years. But in an in-house role, there's not that natural, sort of stepping stone route, or at Fluor, there's, it's very different structure. And so I feel like the structure is really important. Understanding, what does the team look like? What am I doing? How do I fit into that role, or how would I fit into that role? So I think it's sort of, if you want to go in-house, I think that's great. Obviously, it was the right decision for me, but I think it's also making sure you go in-house at the right time and with the right organization that works for you. And the other thing, I guess, is just look at the people around you, because the team is so important. And that's true of private practice too. But I feel like with an in-house role, you have to work so closely, with the team around you in the law department, that it's really important to get on well with and respect, and be able to learn from who you're working with. That's definitely true for me now. And it makes a huge difference to how much I enjoy my job, for sure.
I have learned so much from our conversation today. So thank you again, Fritha, for your time and for sharing your wonderful insights. And thank you as well to our audience for tuning in.
Thank you so much, and congrats on such a great program.
Thank you.